right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's presentation on gardening with wildflowers with Sarah Buckley. My name is Rebecca. I'm program manager for Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground AmeriCorps program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping rules to go over. This webinar is a little different than our normal ones because you have the option to have your camera on if you'd like. Please make sure you stay muted throughout the presentation. You may type any questions you have in that chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. If you do have any questions for Sarah during the presentation, you can use the raise hand feature and Sarah will take your question. This presentation is being recorded and we will be uploading it to the Conservation Nebraska's YouTube page within the next couple weeks. So if you miss any part of today's presentation, would like to revisit any part or share it with others, you will have the ability to do so. Following the presentation, we'll have a very brief survey that should only take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. If anyone in attendance is interested in speaking with a Conservation Nebraska member regarding conservation issues in Nebraska or to find out more about what we do, I will put our email in the chat. So join me in welcoming Sarah Buckley, a sustainable landscape specialist with PlantNebraska, formerly Nebraska Statewide Arboretum. We're excited to have you here, and Sarah, I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. So I am a sustainable landscape specialist. That's kind of a long job title. What it means is I'm a grant coordinator and I work on the ground in communities that get assistance from PlantNebraska to put green infrastructure and trees in their communities. And I love this job because it gives me real hands-on experience watching how wildflowers truly can grow in and transform our communities. So I'm excited for this presentation. I think it's a fun one. And what I want to start with is a question. What is a wildflower? Before we go too much further, there's a few ways to define this, but we all need to be kind of on the same page for the rest of the presentation. So when we use the word wildflower, there's a kind of a symbolic, a romantic idea that comes with that word. We might think
that it just looked like bone infection.
Someone needs to mute their microphone, please. So it can make us think of like the idea of freedom, of being kind of in rebellion against cultural or societal norms. And that's a little bit reflected in the way that we garden with wildflowers, but it's not the whole story. So we might ask the question, is a wildflower only something that's found growing naturally with no human intervention? Well, maybe. That's not super helpful in the garden. We might ask, is it something that has to be planted with no design? Can we actually use a design with wildflowers? Or do we have to kind of toss out the seeds and see what happens? Does it have to be native to exactly where you live? And there's different ways we can define that. It could be the Great Plains. It could be specifically Nebraska. It could be the type of ecosystem. We have so many ecosystems in Nebraska. Which one do you live in? Does it have to be something native to that specific ecosystem? From the dictionary, a wildflower is an uncultivated plant blooming freely in the wild, and it's a flower that's valued for beauty and resilience. That's an important word, resilience. Even and especially as it flourishes in unexpected places. This definition gives us a lot of the reason why wildflowers can be such good problem solvers in our communities. But as we move forward today, we're going to go with my definition in my words that kind of helps me communicate what we can do with wildflowers in the design garden. And that is, to be called a wildflower, in my personal opinion, it has to be found occurring in nature. Even if this particular one I planted in my garden was planted by me, I can find that same plant somewhere in nature. And it has to have a place in an ecosystem. So it has to provide habitat. It has to help take care of our soils. It has to provide some ecosystem services of some kind. And if those two things are true, if it can be found growing in nature and it provides ecosystem services, then it doesn't stop being a wildflower just because we planted it somewhere on purpose. So that's my definition. That's what we're going to move forward with for this presentation. And it's okay if you think about that a little bit differently. Why are we going to plant with wildflowers? Especially if they come with all of these ideas of kind of a wilder aesthetic or maybe an uncultivated look. Why would we bother with them? And the short answer is that we critically need more biodiversity in our design landscapes around our homes and in our towns. But what biodiversity comes down to is that they provide habitat. So wildflowers have a place in an ecosystem where local insects, local mammals and birds, they know what they can expect to receive from that plant. And so that plant becomes a functional part of the ecosystem and provides habitat. As we saw in that dictionary definition, wildflowers are resilient. And especially in the Great Plains, native plants are well adapted to very variable weather patterns. And different biomes that they come from have weather patterns that aren't predictable year to year. And that makes these wildflowers kind of exceptionally resilient to environmental challenges, pests and diseases, and all the extra things that we throw at a plant when we bring it into an urban area. And then finally, they're beautiful. They just are. They provide a sense of place because their beauty is inherent to Nebraska. When we see plants that are native to here, even if they're mixed in with non-natives in a garden space, they just help us, kind of get a sense of where we're from and where we are. We can all pick out kind of landscapes that could be anywhere. But when you see a beautiful combination of little blue stem and liatris, and maybe some rudbeckia, you feel like you're in a prairie state. You feel like you're in a grassland, and that brings you back to Nebraska. So you've all heard many of these arguments. Wildflowers are just weeds. Wildflower gardens can't be organized. They have to be messy. If you plant with wildflowers, you're just throwing all design to the wind. And frankly, that's just not true. Weed is an unwanted plant. So that definition is subjective. So if you want the plant, it's not a weed. That sets aside noxious and invasive species. Those are a lot less subjective. We don't get to choose on those. But if a weed's an unwanted plant and I want this plant, it's no longer a weed. I would add a little bit to that definition that a weed can also include an unmanaged or in the way plant, even if it's a common garden center variety. One of my neighbors has a spruce tree. You could buy it at any Earl May. It wouldn't by any means be termed a wildflower probably, but the thing grows all the way over the sidewalk. I can't get by it with a stroller or a bike. It's kind of a weed to me, even though it's a very accepted species and it's placed in an accepted spot. So wildflower gardens aren't automatically messy. These two images both include species we would call wildflowers. On the right is, I just think it's a very neat sidewalk to walk down. It's this very little strip of planting space between a sidewalk and the road. And if you had put too large of plants in there, that could be very restricting and feel very wild. But all these plants stop about waist level. The gardener took care that they don't flop into the road or into the sidewalk, and they keep that sidewalk very clean and maintained. And on the left, this is the front of the International Quilt Museum on East Campus. There's no more formal landscape around me and my office. It's planted to look like quilt blocks in very formal, repetitive spaces. They just happen to use wildflowers in it. So we'll talk a little bit more later about finding our personal styles and using management techniques that benefit native plants specifically compared to maybe some more cultivated varieties. But yeah, wildflowers are not inherently messy. What we do as a plant can make it messy for sure. So we have two more definitions. We've got wildflower. We know what that is. But as we move into gardening with wildflowers, we need to define a garden. And again, these are my words. I took them from dictionaries and commonly, assumed meanings, but this is how I would define a garden. It's a place where people put plants on purpose. Any place where people put plants on purpose becomes a garden. This is my backyard. This is where I put plants on purpose. And I didn't just place them here randomly. I put them there. They are a little bit random. This is my collection garden. There's a little bit of everything in here. But even though it's a little bit wild, even though this is early spring, so I know it looks nice and clean, but the reality is this garden can overflow sometimes. Even if I intended to benefit wildlife with this garden, and I did, I have many habitat species in this garden. I'm trying to attract butterflies and bees to it. I'm still the primary beneficiary because I planted it for my own enjoyment and my own, kind of feeling of goodwill for creating that habitat. It didn't just occur randomly. And I would argue that because the garden is a place where we put plants and where we benefit from them, it's okay for us to consider our own comfort when we plant those species. In fact, it's even good that we plant those species being considerate of our neighbors and the way that they need to move around our property on sidewalks and roads. Because even though it provides many ecosystem benefits, a garden is still a place where we put plants and where we are existing near those plants. Which brings us to our next definition, is a landscape, is a greater, larger. There's gardens inside landscapes. A landscape is where humans and plants meet. They're interactive. They're in our towns, they're in our neighborhoods, they're in our yards, they're around our businesses. And when we ignore the fact that landscapes need to be interactive, we get frustration. We create unapproachable spaces with overwhelming large beds that we don't really know what to do with. So this garden is at St. Leo's Church in Omaha, and it's huge. The plants in this garden include big blue stem. They include sweet coneflower, things that are well above my head. But they're in well-defined beds with ADA accessible pathways in between. And they clearly, they desire deeply for people to enter this garden, interact with those plants. And you would have to work very hard to walk up and say, this is just a wild, unmaintained space. So when we remember that humans and plants need to interact in a landscape, we kind of separate this idea of a garden, a landscape, even though we're using wildflowers and creating habitat. We're kind of in a separate room from conservation planting or restoration projects, where the primary objective is to recreate a natural landscape that we are going to appreciate. We might hike through, we might drive by, but we are not the primary beneficiaries of those spaces. And they're often set apart just a little bit from our living areas, our walking areas. So those are just two definitions that kind of help us moving forward as we think about how do we take a wild, naturally occurring species and put it in our space where we spend time and where we want to interact with that plant. And we do that by kind of creating some order among the wild. So I have a few tips on how to do that as we design. People want to be shown how to interact. That invitation to be in St. Leo's Pollinator Garden isn't inherent. There's signs everywhere. They host events. They bring tours in. They bring school groups in. It is a very clear invitation with a path and an entrance. And so if we have clear pathways and or just entrances to our spaces, it invites people into them. This photo on the left is from the Denver Botanical Garden. And that's coneflower, that's wild yarrow, that's coreopsis, species in there that get called weeds, that get called wild. But I'm going to say if it's good enough for the Denver Botanical Garden, it's probably good enough for me. I don't think I have that high of standard. So it's not necessarily the plant itself, it's what we do with the plant that welcomes people into our spaces. And then having clear edges or boundaries, just knowing where our garden stops. And where the next garden bed begins it just kind of helps people know where they belong. You know, we all want to know where we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to approach something so that we feel comfortable in a space. And a clear edge, you know, communicates that. And then when we plant things, we can do our research ahead of time. We can look at what the habit and the shape of that plant is going to be as it grows up. So this is that same kind of part of my yard. And then it's turning around and looking at, well, right in front of my patio where I sit, and I want to be able to see over those plants. I want to be able to see that whole garden. I need to be able to make sure I have eyes on children when they're playing. And I want the people who come to join us on that patio to not feel like they've been trapped in there. But if you just turn the camera a little bit to our fence, well, I really don't want to see that way. That's, you know, a neighbor's house, and we want them to have their private space, and we want to have ours. That's where I put my big blue stem, the tallest thing that I grow. And I did that on purpose because big blue stem is not known for behaving well in a garden. It doesn't seem to matter what you do. A nice heavy rain will knock it over every single time. And so I planted it purposely against that fence so that I think it's still standing up on its own in this photo. But a week or two later, we had a big heavy thunderstorm, and I got out the twine and I tied that grass to the fence. Because there's nothing I did wrong in planting it. I didn't plant it too close together or too far apart. That's just its habit. When it gets really heavy and wet with the rain, it tips over a little bit. I can't put a whole prairie in my backyard. I can place that plant where I can provide it the support that its growing habit needs, and where it's not interfering with the view that I want to have. And then using repetition and patterns. This may be one of the biggest secret to landscape design that can make you, as you know, a homeowner or a hobby gardener, you can take a design and make it look incredibly professional if you just think about repetition and patterns. That's what makes a professional design look professional. It's not necessarily the plants they use, although that can play a part. It's the fact that the human eye desires and seeks in everything we look at. We are wired to look for repetition and look for a pattern so that we know here's where I belong, here's what I'm supposed to do. And that you can be super creative with what that repetition is. In this picture on the left, it is repetition of species. It's a row of alliums. It's a row of catmint. It's a section of switchgrass. It's big blocks of single species. But if you're a collector and you like your plants mixed, skip that. Make the repetition be texture. Have fluffy, feathery things next to structural upright things and repeat that. Make it color. Do purple and white and purple and white in different areas. Make it nothing to do with the plants. Use rocks and art, non-organic items to create repetition. Sometimes don't have a photo of it. I really wish I did, but I've been to a garden where each bed is totally wild. In fact, I think they planted it with wildflower seed mixes. There's no pattern in any way, shape, or form to what's in each bed, but the beds are repeating squares down the center of a super wide pathway. And because those beds repeat in a predictable pattern and shape, your eye is okay with the wildness and even loves and appreciates the just kind of wildness of the color in those repeating, bed shapes. And then a really good secret to gardening with wildflowers from prairies, most specifically, is grasses. I work a lot with people who are wanting to build pollinator habitat, and so they're ultra focused on the flowers. They want flowers and more flowers and more flowers. But where do those flowers grow in a prairie? All in a backdrop of grasses. And those grasses, they create, a backdrop is probably the best word. They create the background for the flowers to come out of. This isn't maybe the best photo to show this. This is sedges in a shade garden. And later in the year, there will be anemones and things coming up out of them. We're a little too early in the year for that. But that base layer of grasses in a prairie garden, it creates a blank slate in a way. You kind of move that grass texture and color to the background and you see the flowers coming out of it. But it gives support to those flowers and it gives a framework for us to view them in. So using those 6 tips, we move on to kind of thinking about what's our aesthetic. And this is where there isn't a wrong answer. Using wildflowers doesn't automatically dictate the style that we're using. We're not locked into a wild cottage garden simply because we want to garden with wildflowers. In fact, sometimes using a more formal style is a really interesting counterpoint to that symbolic idea of, freedom and wildness that we think of when we get wildflowers. Sometimes when I communicate this, I very specifically talk about native plant gardens instead of wildflower gardens because it just moves that kind of set idea of what a wildflower looks like kind of off the table. But you get to choose how you place plants in the garden. If you're a collector, if you love a cottage garden, if you want to look as much like a prairie as possible, you might go for something a little more natural. And there's still a repetition here. We have more than one of each species. We have a set number of species. There's only 6 species in this garden. So we get a little bit of repetition there. But there's not a immediately identifiable pattern to how they're placed. Directly contrary to that, with the same number of species and the same number of plants, we have a formal style where we have a very clear collection of each species is planted together. We have all the grasses, we have all the lead plant, we have all the coreopsis, each grouped together. And then we can kind of combine those 2 things into maybe an informal style where we have a little more pattern than the wildness, but a little less formality than the most formal. And when we put the plants on top of that, those patterns are even more kind of obvious when we have the colors and the textures added too. That if you look up at the top left at our kind of natural wild style, you still see repetition and pattern in there. There's still more than one yellow. And maybe we do have more species, but we have multiple yellow species. We have a coreopsis, we have a yarrow, and we have a primrose. And so that yellow becomes our repetition. So much of what we find beautiful is unconscious and it's personal to us. It's formed by the places we've experienced good things and the spaces around us, what they look like when we found joy. And so it's really easy to kind of blame somebody for not finding the same thing beautiful as we do. But the truth is that you don't always get to choose that. You can start to change that. You can learn to adapt to a new kind of style and appreciate something you didn't find beauty in before. And as gardeners, we help that along by making people comfortable in our space that we find beautiful. If we like that more natural look, or maybe we like the more formal look and our friends find formality a little uncomfortable. It's the way we design with those spaces and then purposely welcome people into them that we help them see why we find it beautiful. And that's where that idea that a garden and a landscape are interactive becomes so important. So once we've designed, design is only half of it. After we plant, we have to maintain. And there are some maintenance techniques that are a little more specific to native plants than they are to cultivated varieties. A lot of times we go to the garden center and we find the dwarf this or the compact that. They've been cultivated into a shape and style of formality that does not require such intense maintenance to keep up. And so there are just a couple things we do different with our more natural species of plants, and that is a little bit closer spacing. Rarely in a tall grass prairie, you're going to see the ground. Now, in a short grass prairie, as you move out west, you will see the ground. Plants aren't always touching each other. But when we look at big bluestem and coneflower and our tall grass species, they desire to touch. So when I design with them, I make sure that their mature sizes will overlap. And I have designed things in very, very tight spaced matrices where you have a plant per square foot. That can get hard to manage in its own way. It's not appropriate for every garden. But if we just make sure that mature sizes will overlap a little bit, we'll get the look we're going for. One lonely big bluestem standing on its own would be, with 3 inches of mulch between it and the next plant. It would look a little weird. It wouldn't look natural. That's not where that plant belongs. The second one is the wildflower whack. So in England, they have what they call the Chelsea chop because plants that need cut back, it happens right around the Chelsea flower show. So they call it the Chelsea chop. And we thought, well, that's fun. But in Nebraska, we don't have a Chelsea flower show. We do have wildflowers. And at PlantNebraska, we celebrate Wildflower Week about the same time we need to cut back our floppy species. So we call it the wildflower whack. And this is how I like to manage things like goldenrod. And even the mountain mint in this photo has been cut back. So that mountain mint is naturally maybe closer to 4 feet tall. But in early June, it always seems to flop out and then leave this kind of open center that I don't enjoy. And so in early June, maybe late May, early June, I cut it back to at least in half, sometimes a little more depending on the species. I have a blue sage that I cut back to like 6 inches tall. And that plant doesn't care. That plant has been adapted to life with buffalo. You are nowhere near as mean as a grazing buffalo when you cut that plant back kindly with your pruners. So we cut them back in half or maybe 2/3, and they bloom at a fraction of the height, and they bulk up their stems. So when I cut back my goldenrod, it normally likes to send up like 4 singular strands, and it's a sweet goldenrod. It's one of my favorites, but it just wants to send up 4 or 5 single strands that shoot off this way and that way. But when I cut it back, it bulks up and branches those stems, and it blooms, about 4 feet tall as a nice mounded bush. And I get more flowers out of it too that way. And same with this mountain mint. It kind of fills that center back in, and it blooms at a shorter height that I just appreciate more. Because this is my garden where I, as a person, get to have a little bit of an opinion on how things grow. And then I practice selective cleanup. So when we have maybe a heavily managed landscape, a very formal space where we have, maybe we've got some boxwoods and some Carl Forester grass. That gets cleaned up exactly the same at the same time of year every year. They add a nice mulch layer, they move on. In my wildflower garden, I do a little more selective cleanup. So when my spring bloomers are done, I cut those stems to like 6 or 8 inches. The cool thing about that is now I get stem nesting bees in them later in the summer. In the fall, I have an ironweed that I would love to stay standing all winter because its seed heads are so neat and fluffy to look at. But the thing flops into my driveway every single time. So it gets cut back in October. And we leave as much stem as we can because we do get things that nest in there. And then there's things I don't touch. I don't touch any of my grasses till spring because I like the habitat that they provide. I know that things are nesting in there, and that those warm season grasses really don't need to be cut back until late April, early May. So I practice selective cleanup, and I'll tell you what, in years when I'm busy or tired, it's a lot nicer to do like 30 minutes of cleanup here, 30 minutes of cleanup there than it is to try to take my whole weekend, clean up my whole yard, remulch everything, and try to like stamp it as done. And as a gardener, I like to be in my garden. So that kind of constant flow of small tasks is it's a lot more conducive to me enjoying being in my space. And tying things together. So this is a sneaky little trick that I use in a wildflower garden that maybe we don't talk about as much because we'd like to say, oh, if you just do close spacing and you don't do too early cleanup, your plants will just grow perfectly. Well, wildflowers don't care. They will grow how they want. So you can see in this photo, I think I can get a little, I can draw. You see my twine that I talked about earlier? That big blue stem's been tied to the fence because it got wet and heavy and it fell over. So I tied it to the fence. Here's the ironweed I talked about. And again, you can see very, very closely. My husband just set O-rings into the wall because we tie this thing up so often. He just screwed rings into the outside of our house, and we have a piece of twine that goes around this ironweed every year. It's not what I thought it was. I thought I was planting a shorter species. It was mislabeled. I could have dug it up, but I love it. It blooms, it covers our living room window that otherwise would look at the car. Who wants to see that? So instead, we have this way too tall for its space ironweed, but we've made it work. We tied it to the wall. We didn't have to dig it up and replant. And then I have a Heliopsis, which this year I'm planning to wildflower whack, but I forgot. Frankly, I forgot to cut it back. And it started blooming and it looked great. And then it started blooming along the ground and it looked less great. And I didn't love it. So I pounded a stake in the ground and I tied it up. And as long as things go well this year, I'll remember to cut it back. But the reality is that our gardens won't be perfect. And there's absolutely no shame in a stake and some garden tie if it puts things back where they need to be or keeps that plant in the garden that you really like that just doesn't want to seem to behave itself. We do what we need to do to make it work. And we don't need to remove these species from our garden immediately if they stop, behaving the way we think they should. We get to the part that I'm guessing many of you were hoping I would start with and would get to a lot faster. And that's how do we actually pick the wildflowers we want to put in our garden? And so going back to that definition of wildflowers, that to call it a wildflower, I think personally, it needs to occur somewhere in nature. So that obviously gives us straight species. Great, that's easy. Anything that comes with a straight species name, we're good, right? And then we get the named plants. On the left is Husker Red Penstemon. It comes, I should have wrote it out on the slide. It would be a lot easier to talk about it. It comes as Penstemon digitalis Husker Red. And that's usually our clue that this is a cultivar, but it's a seed strain. It occurs naturally in the world. And the only way to know that is to Google it. So I just encourage you, if you're researching plants and you're interested in something, just look it up. Look up where it comes from. There's things that would surprise you. I'll point out some more seed strains here in a minute when I get to my plant slides that I personally think fit my definition of wildflowers. And then there are occasions where I use cultivars. So not every cultivar changes the plant dramatically. Some cultivars just make the plant a little bit more suited to our landscape while not interfering with the habitat it provides. So this is Little Joe Pye. This is my preferred way to put Joe Pye in my garden because I just don't have a place where I have any ability to put an 8-foot tall blooming plant. But because I love butterflies and bees, I have to have Joe Pye. It's one of our top pollinator plants. It's amazing, and it's such a critical part of a tall grass prairie. Little Joe made that accessible to me, and the way it was cultivated didn't really change anything about the flowers. So look it up, read what was the plant breeder going for, and how much work was done to get there. They changed the genus for Joe Pye. It's now Eutrochium. So it's Eutrochium purpureum Little Joe. The places where I get really antsy about cultivars is when it's X. So when it's Penstemon X, blah, blah, blah. That tells me there's been so much interbreeding that they don't have a species to name. It's multiple things. So do your research and think about it. Decide, does this meet my definition of wildflower? Does this achieve my goals? And does it still let me participate in the ecosystem the way I want to? Then leave a little bit of room for creativity. My garden has a lot of native plants in it. It has a lot of straight species and a few seed strains and some light cultivars. And then I also have great grandma's irises. I love them. They're pretty. And it's okay if we don't mix, there's no need to call it a wildflower garden to never allow for that thing we find pretty that just might not happen to be natural. So I just want to add that while we're talking about wildflowers today, and that's what I'm going to focus on, I don't want anybody to think they have to go dig something up or not plant something they enjoy. This is a garden. This is a place where we are interacting with plants. And if you want that plant there, put it there. A few of my favorite resources, there wasn't an easy way for me to share these with you, so I just want to direct you to our website is plantnebraska.org. That's pretty easy to remember. We have a tab there called Resources and Events, and underneath that we have tips and help and how to. And we have some really great plant lists there. So we have this Eastern Nebraska Flowers for Pollinators. We have a Western one as well. And if you're interested or have a need, we have that particular publication in multiple languages. And I love this publication because we separated it by season. So one of the important things when we're gardening wildflowers is that we plant spring, summer, and fall blooming so that we have a full season interest and food source. And so this whole publication was separated by spring, early summer, late summer, and fall. And then it was separated further by height. And so it just really helps that gardener who's trying to figure out, what do I do with this strip close to my sidewalk? Most of our prairie plants are 6 feet tall. How do I find those small ones? And this, or maybe I have the space. I'm looking for a living screen between me and my neighbor. Give me the tallest thing you've got. I really appreciate these lists for that. They are short though. We kept them to our favorites, to mostly things that are easy to find, and to pretty beginner friendly plants. If you're looking to challenge yourself a little bit, or maybe include trees and shrubs, our Plants for Nebraska list is a little more information too. It designates whether things will grow in the east and west, how much sun they need, water, etc. And it goes all the way from our tallest trees to our shortest perennials. And then a new one, which I just put together at the request of our communications director to kind of answer some of the questions that I discussed earlier in this presentation, is intentionally wild. And these are most of the things you just heard me say, but all those tips for taking our wild plants, our native plants from Nebraska, and putting them into a space that's communicable, that's inviting to other people, and that helps our neighbors appreciate what we're doing. So without further ado, here are my plant suggestions for you. I separated these by color because I could have separated them by any number of things, and I just thought color was fun. So in our pink category, I had a very hard time. I could have had this entire hour just be a plant list. I kept it to 4 plants for each color. And so don't take this list to mean if I didn't put it on here, it's not good. I was hard on myself to pick these for you. So swamp milkweed, one of our favorites. Rose milkweed is maybe, again, a happier name for it. Sometimes we work on how our common name use is communicating what we think of the plant. And the nice thing about common names is we can change them. Scientific names aren't up to us. The great scientists beyond get to choose those, but we can influence common names. And so rose milkweed or swamp milkweed is a go-to for me. I find it easier to establish sometimes than butterfly milkweed. And it seems to behave very well in the garden. Prairie smoke is a favorite of many, many people. It can be a little bit hard to establish until you know that it doesn't like to be wet during the winter. As long as you know that and you kind of don't bury it in mulch, or maybe don't put it where you pile snow up. Don't put it at the bottom of a slope, put it up on the top. It's actually a very resilient plant. We already talked about Joe Pye, whether you like it little or big. And then wild bee balm will always be one of my favorites. I know it's not everybody's favorite because it does get a little bit of powdery mildew. It's a great candidate for the wildflower whack, and that does help a little bit with the powdery mildew problem. But I just love the color, and it's just hard. It's hard to beat for the bees too. Yellow, you could go on for hours with yellow in the prairie, but I kept it short. So gray-headed coneflower, Retivita columnifera. This is one that will seed around. It can be a little bit shorter lived. This lives up to the wildflower name. Wherever you put it, in 2 years, it won't be in that spot. It will be somewhere else. You have to be a little bit open to an informal layout for that one, but I love it. Wichita Mountains is another one of our seed strains. It's naturally occurring, comes from the Wichita Mountains, and not Kansas, but Oklahoma. And it comes true from seeds. So It is a short, it's got the candelabra type flowers of speciosa, but it's only about 3 feet tall. And I strongly prefer it to all of those little goldenrod cultivars because it's a seed strain. Its babies will also be the exact same thing as it. Some of the cultivars like Crown of Rays and Golden Baby, they might be short, but their babies won't be. And so this one it behaves very nicely in the garden. Landsleaf coreopsis. Out of all the coreopsis, I just love this one. I love its sunny yellow flowers. And then if you're into the tall plants, take a look at sweet coneflower or Rudbeckia subtomentosa. Again, you have to be open to it giving its opinion on where it grows in the garden, but it's pretty cool. For white species, New Jersey tea is a shrub. It's only about 3 feet tall, and it can handle being cut back every couple years, but it is a woody shrub. However, I just find it to be a really fitting inclusion. And if you're trying for a more formal look, it will help you achieve that. It is a 3 foot ball. No matter what you do or say, it grows to 3 feet and makes a little mound. Snow flurry aster is a straight up cultivar. But I find it to be one of the ways of making heath aster approachable in the garden. Heath aster, or Symphyrotrichum ericoides, is one of our native prairie species that just has absolutely no desire to behave. It grows tall, it grows short, it flops, it spreads. Snow flurry just makes it so much more approachable in the garden, and fulfills a low growing shade category or fall category that's just hard to find. It's really hard to find those lower growing fall blooming plants. So I do like snow flurry, and that's where I get to use, my prerogative to define wildflower the way that it works in my garden. Calamintha is a straight up non-native. It's not from here. But again, it fits the bill. It fits the habitat bill. There's nothing, you won't find anything more covered in little bees in the late summer and fall. It's in that herb category. Bees always seem to love herbs, and calamint is an herb. And it's just so long blooming. And again, it fits a pretty predictable shape and size. And then of all the mountain mints, I picked Tenuifolium narrow mint mountain mint. It's the one I had in my photo that I like to cut back. They're all good. They're all wonderful. This is the one I like the most. If you like to make tea, you want Virginiana. This one doesn't taste as minty, but it smells really good. And I like the texture that it brings. I'm speeding up a little bit because I know I'm getting closer to my hour, and I want to leave time for questions. But the purples in the prairie, oh my goodness, the purples. Pasque flower kind of fits in that category with prairie smoke. People can give it kind of a reputation for being hard to keep alive. It doesn't want to be wet. Put it up a little bit higher, get it out of where you scoop snow. Be careful as you mulch around it. And it is a very resilient plant. It's one of your first native blooming flower species outside of the woodies in the garden. And it's so soft and fuzzy. Purple coneflower, I do like in a garden as opposed to pale purple coneflower. I just like the slightly more vibrant purple. Both are native, both are wonderful. Pale purple is by far the more common, but I like how the darker purple stands out. There's a liatris for every situation: tall, short, wet, dry, east, west. I picked spicata. It's kind of the most forgiving. It'll take it a little bit wetter. It likes it dry. It'll take it just a little bit wetter. It's a shorter one, thicker flowers. It grows east to west, but really, they're all wonderful. Lead plant. This is a plant for the collector and the person who's open for a challenge. This is you call it suffrutescent. It's semi-woody, so it can be cut back or it can be left as a shrub. It is slow to mature. And when I say slow, it is slow to mature. The rabbits love it. Everything seems to love it. It's going to need a cage. It's going to need patience. But if you give it time, it pays off. The purple flowers kind of look like the fingers on a hand cupped up, and the little pollens come out bright orange. And it's a silver gray kind of soft texture, just adds a lot to You can use it formally or informally, but that texture just adds a lot to our garden. But I would work up to that one. It's taken me, I killed a lot of lead plants before I got one to live. But they're very fun. Blue's a hard category. There aren't a lot of true blues in the prairie. There's a lot of so light purple, they're almost blue. But here's four of my favorites. Again, any of the Amsonias. I picked Threadleaf Blue Star because I love the texture. But all of the Amsonias are wonderful. And again, you can find one for wet to dry, taller or shorter. Baptisia australis or minor. Take your pick. They're both wonderful. Go back to consider what is appropriate for the scale of your garden. Blue sage is definitely in the wildflower whack category. If you leave it to its own devices, it will put up two stems. They will be about 5 feet tall with a little tuft of flowers on the end. I cut mine back hard, and then it gives me multiple branches on sturdier stems and a lot more flowers. But how do you beat that powder blue and combine it with a goldenrod for a fall, color scheme? It's just wonderful. And wild blue flax. This is a plant that's naturally occurs in disturbed soils. So you might find it around like buffalo wilds or blowouts or an eroded stream bank. It likes its soil a little disturbed. If you drive out west, you find it growing along the roadsides because it likes that road edge of disturbed soils. This is one that you should welcome it to move around your garden. It's not a super tall plant. It's very spindly and fine textured. The flowers each bloom for one day and close up. And I think of them kind of as like tissue paper flowers. They make a great combination with primrose. But it's one you have to be open to it moving around. Each individual plant doesn't want to stay here very long. It wants to spread and move. And for our grasses, we've got the good old little blue stem. If you haven't planted the sedge yet, you need to. And hair brevior is one of my favorite plains oval sedge. It's just adaptable to everything. Sunshade, dry, wet. It has a place everywhere. It makes that great base layer. For a little bit taller, if you're into the feather reed grasses, you like that texture, but you want to go more native, switchgrass. And this is a hard one to get the straight species of. There's a lot of cultivars that just kind of adapt the habit and color. There's one for every garden. You can get them tall, you can get them short, upright, fluffy, however you like. And it brings back a little bit of that diversity from our kind of feather reed grass overrun landscapes. And then blue grama. A lot of people know the blonde ambition cultivar is a lot taller. I really like the straight species. It's a different animal in the garden. It runs a little bit. It wants to spread instead of the blonde ambition wants to clump. And it's much shorter. It's only maybe 6 to 8 inches tall. I think it is a really fun border plant. And those little caterpillars are just very fun. So I've sped through those plants a little bit. I assume you've got the recording and the slides if you want to go back to the specific plants I mentioned. But again, I'm from PlantNebraska, and we work to plant Nebraska for healthy people, vibrant communities, and a resilient environment. And including wildflowers in our gardens is about the best way that you could do that. So I think we saved enough time for questions. Is that right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I know I learned a lot, and now I'm just even more excited for spring and creating more habitat in my yard. So thank you. So we are launching a short survey now. So please take just a quick moment to answer those few questions. It helps to support programming like this. And we're also going to continue on to our question and answer section. So you can either put your question into the chat there or use the raise hand feature, and Sarah will call on you to answer those questions. Thank you.
I wasn't too excited for spring before this. Spring's kind of tiring for those of us in the garden industry. But I was refreshing this PowerPoint and looking at all the pictures, and I agree, it got me a little excited for spring on a snowy morning.
I actually have a quick question for you. As far as shade plants, for native shade plants, do you have any favorites there?
So I love bellflowers, and there's only one native species that I'm aware of. I suppose there may be more, but I'm only aware of the one native species. I have an area where I've put in some rosy sedge and some of our native bellflowers, and I'm really enjoying that combination. Um, Columbine is always a go-to. And then for me, designing in, you know, I started and have spent a lot of my time designing pollinator gardens that are almost always full sun, very full prairie. And shade for me has taken a mindset shift to remember that in Nebraska, our woodland edges where our shade comes from are very open. You will see the ground in between and have like a clump of sedges and a little clump of flowers. And when I kind of embraced that and I stopped trying to make the shade like the prairie, I have enjoyed it a lot more. And so I would just say that we have some shade plants. I have had to embrace more non-natives there, but sedges make a great base. And then we've got some beautiful phloxes and columbines and different things that can kind of fill that in.
Can I interrupt real quick?
Yes, please.
My chat says the chat is disabled. So if you're not getting anybody talking on the chat, that's probably why.
Let me see if I can change that. In the meantime, while I'm trying to figure that out, if you do have a question, you can just unmute yourself and ask Sarah.
I was curious about planting from seed versus planting from established plants, because stereotypically, you think of wildflowers always being planted from seed, but I know if you're doing like a very planned out garden, then you might want to start with plants that are already established. I wanted to ask her about that.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't do a lot of planting from seed. I frankly think it's harder. It's harder to make sure you get them to come up, evenly across the whole space you're trying to plant. It seems like if you purchase a mix, it's especially hard to make sure you actually get a diversity. So what they do with those mixes is they throw in two or three things that basically always germinate, and then the rest of the things listed on the packet. What they don't tell you is they're a little bit harder to get to germinate. And so you feel good about the list, but the reality is there's probably two or three that are going to grow well for you. So I prefer to start most gardens from plugs and then add some seed on top of that, especially for species that are harder to start from seed. Anything I mentioned that likes to move around, so that blue flax, penstemons are pretty easy to start from seed. Butterfly milkweed, I think personally, is way easier to start from seed than it is to plug. And so I like to put in a base of kind of set diversity, make sure I've equally covered the ground with plugged plants, and then bring in some seed if I want that really, cottage garden or wildflower. Does that help answer your question? I know I get a lot of people who have kind of that romantic idea of scattering the wildflower seed in. It is just, you have to be, it can absolutely be done and it can be done successfully, but you have to be a little more forgiving of what the establishment period looks like and the time it takes to get that growing.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
I start a lot of stuff from seed, and the last couple of years I've been playing around with starting some like wildflower prairie stuff from seed, and I found actually that I could get a pretty good germination rate if I did it like in the smaller containers, but just like left outside, like in April. They actually came up really well versus just that like free scatter where you don't really know where they land and you don't really know if they're getting the right water requirements or whatever, but I was actually really surprised by the success of just being able to kind of do it the way I would do vegetables, but just outside all the time. Like they don't come in at night. I'm not worried about moving them to shade. They just do what they want. That was actually the most successful thing for me.
Yeah, that's a super great technique. To just take like an open seed, flatten out one with cells, and scatter seed on it, and then just, you know, a lot of our native plants, they want that winter experience of being cold and then a little warm and then cold. That's a kind of a normal part of winter for us here, and that helps break open the seed coat. And then probably the key, and this is what gets missed when we scatter seed, is consistent moisture on seedlings, and those dedicated flats are just a little easier to make sure that happens. I think that's a great plan.
Hi.
Yes, first
So,
the wildflower or the milk jug method is.
so I've been gardening wildflowers for a long time, and I just kind of have this mass of wildflowers. Do you have any suggestions for how to create some order among all of that? I mean, the whole area is just kind of, and some plants are kind of aggressive.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I guess I would start with, do you like it? And if you like it, but you just want maybe more of an entrance to it, I would start with paths. And that could just be as easy as cutting down things in a path where you can walk into the garden. It could be stepping stones, it could be a mulch path, but just if the problem is that it's big, give yourself a way in. And that's where I would start. And then I guess I'd go back to the question of, what do you like or dislike about it? If that's the only thing, the space feels overwhelming and you don't know how to get in, then we solve that. If we have flopping issues, where we have trouble keeping a clean edge, then sometimes we could either do that wildflower whack method just on the edge plants. We could create a hard edge. You saw in a lot of the photos of my yard. We were very lucky because it came with our yard, but a lot of our garden beds are edged with brick, and that's a firm physical boundary. Or we could add to that garden and plant, lower growing, edge holding plants. Sedges are great for that. They're very clump forming and structural, and they'll hold that edge. They're not going to go anywhere, and they're not going to let anything else take its place. If the problem is an individual species likes to kind of take over and beat out other species, that's where I'd use selective maintenance, and I'd cut those seed heads off, especially if they spread by seed. There's nothing, Rudbeckia is kind of known for that. It likes to seed itself in, and then you have more Rudbeckias than you have anything else. But they spread by seed primarily. And so if we just use selective maintenance and cut their seed heads off before they can spread, we prevent that from happening. Hope that gave you a few ideas.
yeah.
So the difference between a straight species and a cultivar. Let me see if I can use our whiteboard function here for a minute, because this is easiest shown in writing, I think. So when we read a scientific name, it's always going to be in italics. I don't know if that's an option for me. We're going to have penstemon, grandiflora. That is the genus, is the first word of any scientific name, and the species is the second word of any scientific name. If we stop there, we have genus, species. We have a straight species. When we see something in quotes, there's a cultivar called prairie snow. That means that humans got involved. Those quotes mean that humans got involved and changed the plant in some way. And that now, if it is a cultivar where we bred it to be that, it usually has to be cloned. It can no longer be grown from seed, it has to be grown from cuttings, or we have to control the pollination of those seeds so that we know that only prairie snow pollinated only prairie snow. Where it gets tricky is those quotes are the same designation that we use to designate a seed strain, which occurs naturally in nature. So you have to do a little Googling each time to find out, why is it in quotes? Is it a cultivar? Is it a seed strain? How much influence did people have over this and how much have they kept? But that's the difference, is a straight species is exactly as we found it in nature. We just kept letting it wild pollinate. It has genetic diversity because it's open pollinated, and we just keep planting it. Versus a cultivar is something that we as humans like, this particular one, not the whole species, this one. And we keep making sure that this one makes new plants that look exactly like it. So often it gets sold as totally evil in the native plant world. There are good reasons for a cultivar, and there are also benign reasons for a cultivar, and then there are problematic reasons. So from the point of view of habitat, when we make double flower things, everybody's probably familiar with a double flowered petunia that has a second row of flowers and it looks kind of like a rose. Well, the way they got that double flower was they caused a mutation that made the reproductive parts of the flower a second row of petals. Cool for us, for bees, hummingbirds, the things that visit petunias, there's now no food there. But they can be attracted to that plant thinking that there's food there. Again, I really like to be careful that we don't make those things intrinsically evil. If we have 2 double flowered petunias in our entire garden of native plants, great. They're not hurting anything, but it's just something to be aware of as we personally decide what is our goal for this garden. Maybe making sure that we have a diversity of straight species versus cultivars so that not everything is cultivated, and we maintain a little bit of that genetic diversity that happens when straight species open pollinate. I hope that's I tried to keep that not too scientific. You can go really deep into that topic and it gets very interesting, but I hope that answered your question. Great. Okay. Top 2 or 3 places. You're going to put me in a tough spot as the employee of a nonprofit, and I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to tell you that I have found straight species native plants at Walmart and at Earl May, and I prefer to shop locally owned businesses. Seed swaps and garden gatherings where people are trading plants are also like a really great. They take a little more planning. You can't just decide on a whim that it's shopping day, but you can find some really great, really hard to find species from those events as well.
I think that's about all the questions we have for right now, unless there's one last one trickling in.
I saw somebody is interested in planting milkweed, but they want to be sure anything they plant near it or next to it doesn't overtake the milkweed. That's one of the reasons why milkweed can be hard to establish. My best stand of milkweed is actually in the worst possible location for me. It's where some seed blew out of the back of my car and decided to grow. I like to plant milkweed in clumps so that, especially if you're planting like swamp milkweed, which is more single stem, I like to plant 3 or 4 together and kind of let them establish their own area so they can kind of support themselves. And then you might also just be careful what goes around them. So just less, I wouldn't do milkweed surrounded by rudbeckias. They're going to immediately take over as an opportunistic species. But maybe that's a good spot for those clump forming sedges. Sedges don't move a lot. They might kind of hold a barrier for the milkweed. But for as important as it is, milkweed is a little tough sometimes. Now I think we might have got them all.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Sarah. I think that concludes our webinar. Thank you to all for attending and filling out the survey. If you do want to share this webinar with anyone who wasn't able to attend tonight, we'll be posting that on our YouTube in the near future. And thank you so much for supporting local conservation efforts. And thank you to Sarah. So have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for having me.